crucial for everybody to understand is, so what's the process like? What are the steps? What do these Ivy League schools look for? Okay, so I want to go through a quick example here using Princeton. In previous seminars that I've done, I've used Harvard because I used to be a former Harvard interviewer and I went there for grad school. But I wanted to give you a glimpse of a slightly different process, right? So Princeton uses a fairly similar method. They use a committee system like a lot of Ivy League schools do. And so their first phase is that they use first readers who are usually like student interns or maybe other university employees that do an initial screening, right? They look at these different applications and they rate your application from unlikely, probably close to like reject, but they can't reject them themselves because they're not admissions officers, right? So they'll mark them as unlikely. Only if room, it would be like, okay, so you're okay, you got some good qualities, we may be able to fit you in. Strong interest, and of course there's a category for high priority, right? So high priority cases would be maybe people that they're trying to recruit for one reason or another, be it like athletic recruiting, or maybe they have certain factors like they're a really strong student and they're a legacy case, right? You know, one or more parents might have attended the school in the past, or it could be some VIP case like their parents are exceptionally wealthy and they could donate a lot of money to the school, or they're like a VIP or celebrity or something. And in many cases, like Ivies will make exceptions for certain students because they want certain students on board. Okay, but if you're there for academic reasons, then if they have very strong interest in you, it's probably because you truly are exceptional, right? So you have like very strong talents and abilities in your chosen academic discipline or in one or more of your extracurricular activities. Okay, so the next phase is they will have two admissions readers and they want to make sure that there's two, so like to counterbalance each other. They can add a third one if there's too much disagreement between those two, right? And these are your regional admissions reps, right? So if in normal years, if you have like the person from Princeton who visits your campus, that's most likely what this person would be, right? So they're the ones who are like the experts in local schools. They're the ones who are in charge of a certain territory, right? So for instance, if I worked at Princeton, one of my territories could be Northern California, South Bay, because like NorCal is too big for any one person, right? So they would be in charge of all the South Bay schools, let's just say, okay? So they would be pretty well versed in terms of all the local schools, how difficult or competitive or rigorous the curricula would be, any special notes of the school that make it distinct from other local schools, for instance. That's their job to know, right? And then they would rate each candidate on a scale of 1 to 5. In Princeton's case, 1 being the best. Harvard's is a similar system, 1 to 5. Dartmouth has a separate system where it's like 1 to 7, with 7 being the best or something, right? So each of the Ivies has their own different numerical system for rating students, but they all rate students somehow, right? Because it's an easy way to be able to see which candidates they feel they're more interested in than others, right? So for Princeton, they will rate you on your academic potential, your extracurricular contributions, and other personal factors, right? So these are things that they would, go ahead and rank you on. From my experiences at Harvard, like ones are pretty rare, right? So I would say like 1 for academics, for instance, would be someone who is like truly exceptional. Like maybe they have like the potential to be a scholar in the field someday, or they've already done certain like professional type work in that field, right? So those are the types of students who would get a 1 on the academic rating, or they're published and they're like first authors for like research or something. They've written the book or something, right? So there are a lot of different ways that someone could be in that like top echelon or category. For extracurriculars, these are students, for instance, who have like national level talent or abilities in certain things, right? Or they're pretty much at professional level already. So they're always these like world-class cellists, for instance, right? Or people who are going to be like in the Olympics for something, right? So many of these schools do want to bring in these students. Now, the key thing to note, though, is that the Ivies are prohibited from giving scholarships for merit purpose, right? So they can't go ahead and dangle a scholarship to try to recruit athletes, let's just say. So what they're looking for here then is more like an added value. They're looking for students who, even though they're getting there for mostly academic reasons, can also be able to contribute to the student body somehow based on their talents and abilities. So that's something that they consider as well. All right, so another thing that they look at too is personal factors, right? So like, have you overcome adversity? Are you naturally very charismatic? Are you someone who is a born leader, someone who can impact your peers and other people, right? So those are things that they look for as well in terms of the class that they're trying to assemble. Now, of course, in recent years, I'm sure you've heard that there's some controversy about this in terms of, let's say, Harvard. There's a lawsuit that was filed that alleges that the personal factors are kind of biased against Asian students, right? Because they say like Asian students tend to be like, there are all these stereotypes that people have of like Asian students being like really quiet, for instance, or not being very assertive or being a leader, right? So one of the key things that you want to do is to defy those stereotypes if you're interested in the Ivy League schools. There are some realities that some people may have some generalizations or stereotypes, but the best way to do that is not to necessarily say, hey, the system is rigged against me. It's to show them that you are more than just a stereotype, that you're definitely someone who can be very, very charismatic and being a leader in your own way. Not every single leader has to be the vocal type, right? So if, let's say, for example, you're naturally just very introverted, you could be more of like a mentor figure, right? So quietly guiding your peers, right? So there are different ways to showcase your strengths. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be always like very outgoing and cheerful all the time if that's not your personality. Okay, so the next phase, phase 3 here, are admissions committees. So of course, they don't want to put any weight on just one or two people. So all these other candidates, once they're rated, then get passed along to an admissions committee who will then look at these ratings and then determine, based on a class that they want to form, what are their needs? Do we need more athletes? Do we need more, like visual and performing arts people this year? Do we have someone, is there a need for like a bassoon player for the band or orchestra, let's just say? I don't know, right? So there are all these different considerations. And so when they're assembling the class, it's a little bit of more art than science. What I mean by this is that, I mean, there are a number of ways you can go, and there's not any, like, many admissions people that I've talked to can say like, oh, I could have actually gone a different way and I wouldn't have been wrong, right? Because it's very subjective. So that's one of the key sort of mysteries of Ivy League admissions, is that it's a very human process. And so if you understand that, and you understand like how to leverage things like your interviews and your essays so that you're putting a spotlight on those subjective personal qualities, then you're able to jump out of the page a little bit more. Even if you have the best of numbers, if there's not anything unique about your profile that makes you stand out, it's going to be very difficult to stand out, right? So, and they want to then pick a number of people to form a very balanced and diverse class. So one of the stereotypes, or sorry, one of the myths that I hear about Ivy League admissions is that you have to be super well-rounded to get into an Ivy League school, right? Some people believe, oh, I have to have a sport, I have to have leadership, I have to have all these different things. That's not necessarily true, right? In my experience, an easier way to get into an Ivy is having one or two really strong points so that you're more pointed rather than being well-rounded, right? So if you're totally well-rounded, but you don't excel in any one or two things, I mean, they do want some students like that, but they don't want a class of like 2,000 well-rounded people. It doesn't actually serve their purposes, right? So the myth is that they don't want 2,000 well-rounded students. They actually want a well-rounded overall class. They want a class that has some good science people, some good music people, some good people for business, right? So the totality of the class needs to be well-rounded, and that's what makes Ivy League admissions very difficult to determine. No, phase 4 is when they make those really difficult final cuts and they deliberate on this. They will go through final committee meetings where they actually even debate with each other, right? So some people will advocate for people that they feel like they want in that class, and some people will shoot them down or play devil's advocate and talk about like, oh, why there's something in the rec letter or the essay that they're worried about, or they don't feel like someone has as high a potential as another candidate. There are a lot of different things that go into the process. Okay, so the decision is then made to either admit the student or defer them or put them on the wait list. Okay, so what are the typical credentials for an Ivy League applicant or an Ivy League accepted student? Well, to be competitive, we normally suggest that you have rigorous coursework. So almost always this means trying to take the most difficult and rigorous classes available at your high school. Okay, so if you want a shot at the Ivies, you can't be ducking the hardest classes. One common thing I've heard is that students who are interested in, let's say, engineering or computer science, they think they're fine if they only take like the hardest math and science classes. But if you actually do want to go to the Ivies, they want overall excellence, because if you go to an Ivy League school, you have to still be able to thrive in English classes, in history classes, right? You still have to be able to write essays. So, and this is very sort of philosophical in terms of the way the Ivy Leagues think of their education. So they think of, in fact, some Ivies don't even call majors majors. They call them concentrations for a reason, right? Because they want students to have a broad based liberal education, and they want you to learn all these different fields. So showing that you can excel in a wide range of fields is actually to your benefit, right? So if you're interested in computer science or some other STEM related field, you still want to show that you're taking the most challenging English and or history classes at your high school. Okay, because if you're not and your peers at your high school are, they will probably stand a better chance to get into the Ivies than you do. All right, so we typically suggest that you have no more than 1 or 2 Bs at most. So 1 or 2 Bs, you can still be in the running, I guess. You could still be in the pool, but the moment you have 3, 4, 5 Bs, I mean, it's not impossible, but you'd have to have something really strong going for you to overcome having that many Bs relative to your like competition. Because I've heard in some years, for instance, like for UPenn, I heard one year about 60% of the applicant pool straight A's, right? So it's going to be very difficult for you to go ahead and overcome that, and showing that you have a stronger academics than students who are showing straight A's who also have similarly competitive classes, right? So that's the key thing, is you need to be, especially if you're a fairly younger student now, if you're like an 8th or 9th grader, you really want to build that up, right? You want to protect your GPA and make sure that you're, getting a really solid GPA, but you also want to take very hard classes. So I think it's like a balancing act. You have to weigh both the rigor of your schedule and also, the GPA. So you can't just go take every single AP available, but get B's and C's. That's not going to impress them. Neither will getting all straight A's, but you're only taking 1 or 2 hard classes per semester. That's not going to impress them either. Now, of course, this changed a little bit because things are test optional, but typically I would say if you are going to submit a test, you do want your scores to be like mid 1500s for SAT or higher, or about 35 or 36 on the ACT, which would put you in the 75th percentile, which is the top 25% of the incoming class, which is where you want to be if you're Asian and you're trying to get there largely for academic purposes, because the bottom 25th percentile largely going to be people they're trying to recruit for one reason or another, like athletics or their legacy cases, for instance. So they're going to be a little bit more competitive with lower scores because there are other hooks or other factors that these Ivies would be looking at. Okay, so as far as activities go, we normally recommend having distinguishing excellence. That's the term that Harvard likes to use for 1 or 2 activities, to the point where you're possibly like at least regionally or statewide competitive, but ideally even nationally competitive for your activity. So that's definitely something that they're looking for potentially if you want to really impress them as far as your extracurricular profiles. They also want to see really strong passion and qualifications for your major, right? These days, volunteering is also especially important because they're looking for students of good character, right? Especially in light of all the recent admission scandals, right? You've heard of all the like the varsity blues kind of scandal and everything. They really are looking for students who show genuine commitment to helping out their communities, people who are really truly ethical, upstanding people in their community. Okay, and of course, leadership is a plus factor as well, right? So if you can show that you could be a leader in your school clubs and or like your ASB or student government, that is definitely something that can help set you apart as well. Okay, some other things. I talked about the importance of volunteering. Why is volunteering so important? So about 4 or 5 years ago now, right? So Harvard put together a report after they had a big conference of all the different top admission schools or top colleges. Their admissions people met together, and they came up with 3 main recommendations that they're looking for in terms of the trends of what they want to see as far as their incoming classes. So the first one is that they wanted to see meaningful, sustained community service. And one of the key recommendations that they said is that they wanted to see at least 1 full year of sustained service. So instead of just like racking up all your hours at once in terms of like, oh, I did a 1 or 2 week volunteer program where I volunteered in some small village in China, and then I did no volunteering for the rest of high school. That's not nearly going to be as impressive as maybe doing something consistently, even just for like 1 hour, but you do it for like 1, 2, or even 3 years for some students, right? They want to see more long-term dedication and commitment to whatever it is that you're doing because they feel like it's more genuine that way, right? So that you're actually doing something because it is personally important to you and you want to take the time out of your schedule to give back to a certain group or community. All right, so they also are looking for things like collective action that takes on community challenges. So if you want to show yourself as being proactive, trying to help out with issues in your local communities, for instance, that looks good to them because this is also evidence that they can see that you could be one of these like, you know, instrumental, difference makers by the time you graduate, right? That's one of the things that a lot of Ivy League schools are looking for. When you graduate, they want to see that you're giving them a good reputation by helping impact society in some meaningful ways. So that's definitely something that they want to see. And then lastly, especially given the a concern about things like, of course, race relations. They're looking for evidence that you've engaged in authentic and meaningful experiences with diversity. Like you're trying to, say, for example, increase the diversity in your school or local community, that you've challenged yourself by exposing yourself to other races and cultures. That always looks good for a lot of these schools. And therefore, this is definitely something that if you have this in your profile, I would really try to highlight these in your applications if you are shooting for Ivy League level schools. Okay, so let's also look at some data based on what the schools have. So I drew this chart or this table here from something called the common data set, right? So I wanted to do a side-by-side comparison because for a lot of people, they will look at one college independently. You can find this simply by Googling common data set and the name of each college. So the different letters here, VI means very important. So in like that pinkish red color, that's the most important things for them. All right. I means important. C means it's considered, and NC means it's not considered. So what are some takeaways here as we compare the Ivy Leagues to each other? Oh, by the way, if you're really sharp and you notice that one of the colleges is missing, it's because Columbia historically has never released their common data sets. Okay, but we can still try to deduce certain trends here based on what we see from the Ivy League schools. So the first one I want to draw your attention to is that Harvard went ahead and just went C all the way, right? So they just want to say, okay, we consider these and we don't consider these. So they're sort of opting out by not sharing with you things that they consider more or less important than others. But for at least for the other 6 that we have here, there are some things that we can draw in terms of like relative priorities they might have. All right, so the first thing I want to draw your attention to is Penn in particular puts slightly more weight on the interview than for others, right? So whereas for other schools, the interviews are less important than say like the recommendation letters, the interview itself is slightly more important for Penn than the other Ivies. Okay, another thing I want to draw your attention to here is if you look at the very bottom, there's this category called level of interest. And this is basically what they call demonstrated interest. Some colleges and universities actually track which students are more interested in them. Okay, and the way they do this is through certain factors like, did you visit their campus? Did you sign up for one of their info sessions? Have you corresponded with their admissions office and or one of their professors, right? Do you have family that attended there? Or are there certain factors that let them know that this is like your #1 school and you're really dying to go there? So the two that stand out, of course, here is you'll notice that both Penn and Dartmouth have that as a factor that is considered, whereas none of the other Ivy League schools actually consider your level of interest. So if you happen to be really very impressed by and high on Penn and Dartmouth, those are schools that you want to go for, then it actually is strategically important for you to show them that you're very interested in the school. So it's a little harder to visit the school now because of COVID, but if you're a younger student in future years, you can try to go ahead and arrange a visit. If there's an optional interview, by all means, do it, because that is also a good way for you to show interest in the school. So, which also synergizes really well with the fact that Penn highly values the interview. Okay, so if they do have an optional interview, it's not really optional if you really want to go to Penn. Okay, so what are some key takeaways here? So as you probably saw from the data we showed here, academic factors are still the most important, right? So GPA, if available, class rank. So this is only very important if your school does class rank. Don't view it as a negative. If your school does not do class rank, then this becomes a not considered if your school just simply doesn't do class rank. Okay, so the academic factors tend to be the strongest, but for many of them, they also put a high premium on things like your extracurriculars, talents, and abilities. Now, of course, it's very hard to really isolate any one of these factors because they're kind of intertwined, right? Because how else are you going to show your talents and abilities if not maybe through your essays or the interview? So they're kind of all linked in some ways. So you want to view these things as more like the soft factors, whereas things like your GPA and standardized test scores are more like the hard factors. They're the number-based sort of components to your application. Okay, some other things here too is they might factor geographical diversity to some extent. So if you live in an area or a state where they don't have as many applicants, it might be a plus factor, right? If you're a really good student for there. Unfortunately, if you live in Southern California, there's a lot of applicants. So it might actually work slightly against you because the field is a little bit more competitive. So as you can see, religion is not a factor. We already talked about demonstrated interest for Penn and Dartmouth. Okay, and that Penn actually values the interview slightly more than some other Ivies. Okay, so now let's actually start taking a look at ways for you to strengthen your profile. Okay, so what can you do to set yourself apart a little bit more? Okay, so I have 4 main recommendations for you tonight. So one is to channel your energies to activities that you're most passionate about and that you're the most talented in, right? So if you're choosing between going really broad and having way more activities versus, say, for example, committing yourself to 1, 2, or 3 main activities, if you can be really good at 1 or 2 things, I would say it's probably better to go the specialist route, okay, and get as good as you can for those 1 or 2 things, and still have maybe 1 or 2 sort of other activities to round out your profile. Okay, it's still good to have other things as well, but I would say, depth is going to be better than breadth in this case, as far as like distinguishing yourself from other Ivy League applicants, right? So if you're, say, for example, choosing between joining a sport purely for the sake of joining a sport, but you're not spending enough time on something that you're even more talented in, like, I don't know, like debate or music, for instance, then I would say it's probably strategically better for you to focus on that one thing that you can be even more talented in, if you can focus on it to the point where you can get forms of achievement or recognition to distinguish yourself from your peers, possibly even nationally. Okay. So there are a couple of buzzwords that I've heard from my former classmates and contacts in admissions. They're really big on these 2 phrases: love of learning and genuine passion. So you don't want to present yourself as just this hardworking, grinding kind of student, which unfortunately sometimes is kind of a stereotype of Asian students. You just work really hard, but you don't genuinely have passion maybe for certain academic subjects. You're just doing it because of the grade, right? So I know a lot of students who defy that stereotype. That's not really what they're about. But unless you work hard to show that that's not the case, sometimes they might have general misconceptions of Asian students. So you really have to work hard to sort of disprove those stereotypes. Okay, so show evidence of love of learning. Try to do as many like maybe optional things outside of your class. Talk to your teacher about things. Don't just do the work and get an A. Show your teacher that you really thoroughly enjoy the subject, right? And that should show itself in terms of your recommendations as well. Okay, which leads me to my next point here. With the declining emphasis on standardized testing, because even if they go back to requiring the SAT, it's probably never going to have the same significance or weight that it used to, okay? Because colleges are sort of adjusting to this new normal of the SAT not necessarily being as big as it used to be, right? So the narrative, the mentality around standardized testing is changing. So that yes, it's still going to be an added factor, but it's probably not going to have the same prominence that it used to in prior years. Okay, so Ivy League schools are also looking for top shelf intellectual potential. So yes, good grades are important, but that's more like a starting point. You do want to show yourself to be someone who has this potential to maybe be a scholar in the field someday, right? So if, say, for example, you're going in a field where like an internship or some research can be very beneficial, yes, that would definitely highly advise you to pursue those types of options to set yourself apart even more. Competitions are a good way to distinguish yourself as well. So, like math Olympiad, like physics Olympiad, those are all good ways to show that you have much more interest and passion, but you also don't want to come across as like, oh, she's just good at memorizing stuff, right? So find other channels, find other opportunities to show that you have genuine passion for your subject.